Hello guys, I'm going to hit a home run today and explain to you about shock absorbers on this episode of I Never Knew. The name of this episode is going to be The Shocking Truth, and this is going to be about, you guessed it, shock absorbers, also known as dampeners. There's three different main types of shocks, and when it comes to lift kits, they usually have options to choose different shocks. And the first one that a lot of kits come with would be hydro or hydraulic shocks. And those are going to be the lower end, the cheaper shocks. They're cheaper to produce, and that's why they're always usually included in the base kits. Well, first of all, how a shock works is you have a tube here, or a cylinder, and the cylinder has a fluid in it, an oil, hydraulic. That's where the hydro comes from, the name. And basically, attached to this rod, there's a piston. And when the piston goes down, or when the rod goes down, it's pushing the piston through that hydraulic fluid, and basically that's where you get your dampening from. And the way shocks change their dampening, there's a lot of ways to do it, but it basically has to do with how fast the fluid can move past the piston that's attached to your rod here. And that's what gives you different dampening rates and so forth, or valving. There's also valves inside of the shock absorber itself that bypass fluid and all that kind of stuff. So, like I said, there's hydraulic shocks, which would be like this one here. This is an old BDS shock that we took out of our dumpster, but it's for an example. This would be a hydraulic shock, and the way you can tell usually right away is hydraulic shock, you'll be able to extend or compress. You'll be able to compress it, and it won't spring back up. The ones that do spring back up are going to be a nitrogen charge shock or a nitro shock, which like this Rancho here. So when you push this down, obviously it comes back up on its own, and that's because of the nitrogen charge that's in the shock. It's basically a pressurized gas in the shock, which will force the piston back up, and that's where you get that from. So sometimes people think that just because the rod doesn't come back up on their shocks, that their shocks are bad, but not necessarily. They could just be hydraulic shocks and don't have nitrogen in them. The differences between them: hydraulic shocks typically offer a smoother ride. Older cars and trucks back in the day, in the 70s and 60s, nitrogen shocks were only really in racing, and most of the stuff on the road was all hydraulic shocks. And so everything back then pretty much had hydraulic shocks, and that's why everything kind of rode so floaty back then, almost like a boat, because the shock technology wasn't as complex as it is today for everyday cars. So hydraulic shocks, like I said, tend to offer a softer or smoother ride, but the one big drawback to a hydraulic shock is the fluid aeration. Basically what happens is once the shock starts cycling, meaning compressing, when the piston starts moving up and down, the hydraulic fluid inside the shock will actually aerate or fill with air bubbles, and that causes total loss of controlled dampening, and then the shocks basically become even less effective, and your dampening rates change, and then soon enough, if you keep cycling, then the fluid also heats up, and it's kind of like a brake fade sort of deal. If you use your brakes over and over and they heat up, they fade. This kind of happens with hydraulic shocks because of the aeration that goes on when compressing them up and down many times. The fluid heats up and aerates, and you lose your dampening characteristics that your shock started out with as. So that's why they came out with nitrogen shocks, and that's where nitrogen shocks come into play. Because what a nitrogen shock does is, it'd be nice if you could, I can't really show you an example because you'd have to have a cutaway. But so basically you have your hydraulic chamber with the oil in it, and then on the other side you have a nitrogen chamber which pressurizes, and because it's pressurized, it doesn't allow the hydraulic fluid to aerate. So no matter how much you compress or cycle your suspension, the fluid will not aerate, and therefore it keeps your dampening characteristics the same as when it started or as it was cold. So the point of a nitrogen shock, which are what's on pretty much all modern vehicles today are going to have nitrogen charged shocks, simply because they perform much better than a hydraulic shock. Typically they do have a little stiffer ride, but if your suspension or spring rate is set up for a nitrogen shock, the ride will be fine. A lot of times people will complain of a harshness in ride, and that's because usually it's because they go to a nitrogen shock on a vehicle that was originally equipped with a hydraulic shock. And so a nitrogen shock actually can increase spring rate slightly, so it'll cause a stiffer riding sensation, if that makes sense. But in the performance world, nitrogen charged shocks are the only way to go. Cost, well, like I said, usually with lift kits, when it comes to lift kits, usually the base shock is a hydraulic style shock because they're the cheapest to produce. The next step up would usually be a nitrogen charged shock, which, like I said, performs better because it doesn't fade, as I was saying, or aerate the fluid, causing the dampening characteristics to stay consistent. So they're a little more expensive because they're more expensive to produce because there's hydraulic fluid and there's a nitrogen gas charge inside the shock. So those are going to be a little more expensive, usually next step up. And then after that would be, it's usually the same concept. It's a nitrogen charged shock, would be like a coilover shock, which we have here. As you can see, this is going to be a Fox coilover. And a coilover, if some of you don't know, a coilover is a shock absorber basically, or a dampener with a coil spring around it. It's a self-contained unit. Rather than having a coil spring and the shock, it's a coil spring and a shock combined as one piece. And usually a coilover signifies that it has adjustable ride height capabilities or spring rate capabilities, so you can adjust spring rate or ride height, just like these Fox coilovers do. And this one, as you can see, has a big reservoir up here. This is what that's called. It's called the reservoir, and it's an external reservoir. And what that is the external reservoir is an additional, basically, chamber to allow or increase the capacity of the shock's cooling capabilities. So like I said, heat, like most things, isn't good. And same thing in shocks. Heat will cause a lot of problems or cause you to lose your dampening characteristics of the dampener. So what an external reservoir does, it allows an increased capacity so you can work the shocks harder and longer without having that shock absorber fade, as I said. And so that's something that you'll see on like race cars or trucks. A lot of them will have external reservoir shocks because they're being cycled so much. And it allows you to dissipate the heat better and keep the shock working properly. So that's what that is. And this also has a normal Fox 2.0 nitrogen charged shock as well for added dampening. So I mean, it all depends on what shock to choose. All depends on what you're looking for, whether you're looking for comfort or whether you're looking for performance. You know, that's something you gotta decide, and will help you choose what shock you want to get. Durability and longevity of a shock doesn't necessarily have to do with the style of shock, but more so how the shock is made itself and the materials involved. So you can have a nitrogen gas charged shock that is going to blow out or wear out in a year, and you could have a cheap hydraulic shock that lasts 5 years. And it's usually just because of the materials involved and how the shock is made that contributes to longevity. Like I said, hydraulic shocks are more for a comfort ride. If you expect any sort of performance out of your shocks, you shouldn't probably go with hydraulic shocks. And then also, like I said, for coilovers, they typically are derived from the racing application, and they're for all-out performance, whereas the nitrogen charged shock like this here would be for anything in between that for your daily driver. Why to upgrade? Well, one of the biggest reasons to upgrade your shocks is shock absorbers are probably the biggest factor in ride quality. And so people will complain sometimes that their shocks, or their truck, I should say, rides very stiff or is very loose, and that's usually directly related to the shocks on the truck. So shocks have a huge impact on how the truck handles and performs. So that's why I always suggest people to maybe spend a little bit more money and upgrade your shocks, because you will definitely benefit from it in the long run. You may save a couple of dollars initially, and that's fine. If you want to go with the cheap shocks and then eventually upgrade, that's perfectly fine. That's probably what I would do, honestly. But just know that shocks do have a major factor in ride quality. And then another thing that we get a lot is which way the shocks mount. And that depends on the manufacturer, really, because I've seen both where this Rancho shock will typically be mounted with the body down, and that's how they all come in the truck. Whereas an aftermarket shock, well, that's a Bilstein, but that's a Toyota factory shock. Fox shocks, I know that for a fact that Fox shocks allow you to install them either way, body up or body down. And it depends usually on what kind of clearance issues you have and whatnot, but we usually install them with the body facing up. But like I said, it all depends on the manufacturer. And usually when you get a shock, it says in the instructions which way it's supposed to be mounted, whether it's body down or body up. But yeah, we get that one a lot too, which way do my shocks go? And it depends usually on the manufacturer of the shock. But like I said, Fox shocks can go either way. All right, so I kind of ran through the basics of shock absorbers, because this is a discussion that you could continue forever, and there's so many combinations and there's so many options out there. But I kind of just wanted to touch on the three major shocks that you see when purchasing a lift kit, or at least on trucks in general. So I mean, if you have any more questions or you want to learn about something else, I guess reach out to us and let us know what you think. And for now, I'm gonna sign off because I have to go back to work and I gotta go order some pizza. So I'll see you later.